few months ago, I was sent this drone, the HOVERAir X1 Pro Max. It's a tiny, portable, follow-me drone that promises to capture smooth, cinematic shots, all without a controller. You launch and land it straight from your hand, and it folds in half so that you can easily carry it in a pack or even just in your pocket. And I'd seen friends flying the original Hover X1 in the past, and frankly, I was less than impressed with the results. But the Pro and the Pro Max here have some really impressive specs, so I figured that it was time that I put it to the test myself. And the question I had was whether something this small really can come close to a full-size drone with a remote in terms of quality. And so over the past few months, I put it through the ringer, flying it in some heavy conditions and at altitude. First on the Tour de Mont Blanc, then down at Mammoth Lakes, and finally in Peru. So I'll show you a bunch of that footage now, and I'll talk about who I think this drone might be best for, especially this higher end model here, the Pro Max, and the use cases where I think it comes up a little short. So let's start by talking about the specs. The base model, the HOVERAir X1, records at up to 2.7K at 30 frames per second. It's definitely entry level, but perfect for first-time drone users. And it's the lightest in the series, but it has the shortest battery life and flight times. But it only costs $300 US, which is much lower than the X1 Pro and the X1 Pro Max. The X1 Pro records in 4K at 60 frames per second, while the X1 Pro Max can capture up to 8K at 30 frames per second. But there's a caveat there that I will discuss here in a minute. 1/2 inch and 1/1.3 inch type camera sensors, respectively. And the X1 Pro can shoot photos in up to 12 megapixels resolution, while the X1 Pro Max does up to 48 megapixels. And it's got double the internal storage at 64 gigabytes. And internal storage is a really nice feature, by the way, since you can avoid using memory cards if you don't plan on shooting too much footage. The X1 Pro has rear and side collision detection using proximity sensors only, while the X1 Pro Max has both vision-based and proximity sensors for collision detection. Although I should say that with these prop guards, this drone really is made to crash. I've crashed it a few times in trees and it was totally fine, as long as of course you can reach it to salvage it. They both have some other flight times at up to 16 minutes. Although of course this is going to depend on the conditions, like how much wind there is, and the altitude, and how fast that you're flying at. They weigh pretty much the same, but the X1 Pro Max supports HDR 10-bit HLG and H-log recording. But that's where the caveat that I mentioned comes in, which I'll talk about now. This footage was all shot in 4K in H-log, which will record in 10-bit color depth. And while the Pro Max can record technically in 8K, that resolution only seems to work in 8-bit, or what's called normal video mode, not in H-log or HDR. Which, by the way, isn't a true S-log format. It seems to be HOVERAir's own flavor of log, but ultimately just a slightly flatter Rec. 709. Now, having said all of that, I was pleasantly surprised by the quality of the footage. It's still nowhere near that of my DJI Mini 3 Pro. It doesn't have nearly as much dynamic range, but considering how small and how light this is, not bad at all. And it's so much more convenient. And that's what I want to talk more about now. What makes the HOVERAir so special is its ability to work without a remote. After all, it's marketed first and foremost as a selfie or auto-follow drone. It's got about a dozen intelligent flight modes ranging from a really cool spiral effect to a dolly, a zoom in and zoom out, and of course, it can follow from the front or from the rear. So this really should be the primary use case or the problem that you're trying to solve for if you're considering buying this drone. But you can get what they call a beacon here that helps with tracking, which can then also be turned into a remote with these two additional pieces. Now they sent me this all to test as well, and it does work really well with a built-in little screen here on the beacon module. But I feel like if you're going to go through all this trouble of carrying all of this, the extra weight and the extra setup time, you may as well just carry a full-size drone and remote because you're getting close to the same size and weight. Not to mention, again, the hassle of using a traditional drone and the remote with all that extra setup time with all these additional accessories. The whole benefit for me is that I can carry it in my upfront pocket and just quickly pull it out and launch it without a remote, literally in a matter of seconds. And that's where those intelligent flight modes come in, which can be chosen using this little digital screen here and pressing these two arrows once you turn the drone on. And then you just press the button again and it begins the countdown takeoff. It counts down from 3 and takes off right from your hand. But then if I do want to take over and control it manually, I can actually actually do so with the HOVERAir app on my phone. And this way I'm sort of getting the best of both worlds without having to carry the additional remote and the beacon system, since I'm basically always carrying my phone anyway. Now, having said that, you don't get the same control and dexterity that you do with the app compared to using the joysticks on a remote like this, or any other remote you might be used to using. You can't do the subtle movements required for more complex and cinematic shots. But for very basic maneuvers, the manual control using the app works totally fine, especially for just the odd landscape or establishing shot where the subject tracking and the intelligent modes wouldn't work. So who is this for? Well, first and foremost, I think it's pretty clearly aimed at content creators who don't want to bother with a full-size drone. Either you don't want to learn how to operate one, or you want to be able to take advantage of those follow modes so that you can film yourself. And this is what this drone truly excels at. Although in that case, you may be happy with the HOVERAir X1, the base model. 2.7K resolution is plenty for posting to Instagram, and the price tag of $300 US is obviously going to be much easier to swallow if this is something that you're only going to use once in a while, mostly as a toy. But if you're serious about quality, like me, and if you plan on doing some color correction in post, then the Pro or the ProMax are the only two versions that I would seriously consider. And while this isn't going to replace my larger drone, it is a great supplement for times where I maybe wouldn't otherwise carry a drone because it's either too large or too heavy, or just for those times where I'm not really sure I'll use one, but where it would be nice to have one for maybe a quick summit shot. Sort of like how I personally use cameras like the Insta360 as a supplement to even my GoPro and of course my mirrorless camera. And as they say, the best camera is the one you have on you, and sometimes carrying a mirrorless camera, or in this case a full-size drone, just isn't practical. But there's another sort of edge case, which is for content creators like me who already own a larger drone, and where maybe I do tend to carry it with me from time to time when I'm fast packing. I often do carry my Mini 3 Pro on my multi-day adventures, like when I'm doing the Tour de Mont Blanc with Audrey. But when I'm in a group, like these two trips that we recently hosted on the TMB and in Peru, a larger drone wasn't always practical for another reason, because it takes time to set it up with the additional remote and to get a satellite signal before I can take off. And then I've got to pack it all away at the end. And in most cases, I'm worried about slowing the group down. And that's where this little guy came in. Although another quick caveat, this one about those intelligent modes. Now there's something called omni-terrain mode, which is activated if you power on the drone and you hold still for about 30 seconds before taking off. And I'm not totally sure, but I think what's happening in that case is that it is actually getting a satellite signal before taking off, instead of relying solely on its sensors for stabilizing and orienting itself in space. And this is required for flying over any complex terrain, especially water. Now, I really pushed the limits of this drone by flying it over cliffs and waterfalls without that mode enabled, but you're always going to be limited in altitude, I believe to 30 meters, which is going to be a problem if you're trying to fly it manually, especially to get those larger landscape shots, but less so if you're only doing something like a quick zoom out mode. But when I was trying to enable omni-terrain while partially obscured by forest canopy, for example, while we were in Peru, it took forever to get a signal. In fact, a couple of times I just was never able to. After waiting for like 5 minutes, I gave up. And I think this is just a limitation of such a small drone, which by necessity also has a much smaller GPS antenna than a full-size drone would. So I guess that's all to say that this drone can be much quicker and more convenient until it's not. And there are definitely going to be conditions where you'll wish that you had a regular sized drone and remote, which will give you much longer flight times with better range, better handling of heavy winds, and of course, better quality. And lastly, it's surprisingly loud, given how small the motors are. You'd think that a smaller drone would allow you to better fly under the radar, so to speak, but it sounds more like an angry swarm of wasps than my larger DJI Mini 3 Pro. But for those creators who want the best quality out of the absolutely smallest package available, the X1 Pro Max here is what I would recommend if you can afford it. The X1 Pro feels like an awkward in-between, given that it still costs about $500 US, and while it does offer higher resolution of 4K, instead of 2.7K, not being able to record in 10-bit might leave you a little disappointed with the results. But at roughly $700 US for the X1 Pro Max, what it is not is a cheaper alternative to a full-size drone. And I cannot stress that enough. In fact, this is actually a little more than the DJI Mini 4 Pro is. And that's before you add on the optional items like the remote and the beacon, along with spare batteries. So I wouldn't recommend getting this as your first and only drone if you are a serious content creator, especially as a professional. For the same reason that I don't recommend filming everything on an Insta360, which itself serves a very specific but limited use. But as a supplement, or as I often say, as another tool in your storytelling toolbox, this can be very powerful. You'll definitely be seeing me use it a lot in my upcoming content. I'll pretty much be always carrying this in my running pack for most of my bigger adventures, even if I'm not necessarily planning on shooting much content. It's that small, lightweight, and convenient. It's just a no-brainer. And I'll likely always pack it as a backup drone with me when I travel as well. So what do you think? Is this something that you might want to experiment with yourself, or do you think it's too narrow of a use case to warrant the cost? Tell me about it in the comments below. And if you want to see more of this drone in action, then check out the 2 episodes of my series, Time on Feet, from the Tour de Mont Blanc and the Salcantay Trek in Peru.